Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, dear participants. Welcome to the second session of the textual study of the Quran that we started off last week. So, just to recap before we start off today's session, I had introduced this course to you and I had informed you all that this study would be based on the approach of the Farai scholars. And we had also learned some of the basics of the approach of the Farai scholars. I had introduced the Quran to you the way they understand it. So we looked upon some of the important things, like for example, we studied how the style of the Quran has to be very deeply understood by a serious student of the Quran if he or she would like to go into a deep understanding of the Quran. We discussed that the Quran is in the form of dialogues, and these dialogues are embedded in sermons delivered by the Almighty. So the Almighty is talking to real characters which were found in 7th century Arabia. So they were the hypocrites, they were the Muslims, the believers, the disbelievers, the Prophet himself, Satan, of course, the Jews and the Christians, the idolaters. So all these characters, they figure in these conversations. So basically, these sermons or conversations from God, they have been narrated by God, but in the form of a dialogue. And at times, this dialogue is also a monologue in which there is one character discussing something or dilating or developing a whole argument. So we have to understand the style of the Quran in order to get a good grasp of the way the discourse of the Quran develops. And some of the important areas that we need to look in this regard is that if you don't gauge this fact that the Quran is in the form of sermons, in the form of a sermon delivered by the Almighty, and in that sermon we have monologues and dialogues, we would not be able to appreciate certain shifts which occur during the course of a surah, and they would rather seem to portray the Quran as a disjointed collection of verses. But if we understand how the discourse progresses and it shifts from one speaker to another speaker, one addressee to another addressee, and how at times some of the very, very subtle instruments of language are employed, we would be in a much better position to appreciate the style of the Quran. So we also talked about the theme of the Quran, which of course here refers to the subject matter of the Quran. So the subject matter of the Quran, we know, is the final judgment which took place in the times of Prophet Muhammad regarding his addressees in this world. And this is something which has been preserved by the Quran so that for the rest of mankind, they are always able to refer to the Quran, and they are able to understand that accountability which befell all these nations of prophets of God, messengers of God, is going to befall all mankind one day. And especially if this is not happening in this world, as is the case with the post-prophetic era, then this will definitely take place in the hereafter, and everyone shall be called to account. So therefore, we have to understand that there are some specifics in the Quran. So the most important area regarding the subject matter of the Quran to understand is that this subject matter actually depicts the divine law of the Almighty regarding his messengers. And this divine law is only invoked in the era of God's messengers. It cannot be invoked after the post-prophetic era or the post-messenger era. And some of the specifics, for example, one of the most important specific of that era is the Almighty himself punishes people for denying the truth, and he uses either natural disasters or the hands of believers to undertake this punishment, to conduct this punishment. But this is the prerogative of the Almighty, and he did this in the era of his messengers. Once they have passed away, once that era has finished, this law can never be invoked. So therefore, the important consequence here that we have to understand is that the disbelievers, the idolaters of the times of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ and the Quran, they are not the same disbelievers, so to speak, and the idolaters that we see today around us, because the disbelievers and idolaters of the times of the Prophet Muhammad, to them the truth had been conveyed conclusively, and they were punished in this world. And some of the punishments which are mentioned in the Quran, like for example, executing them if they don't accept the truth, or not befriending them, or not praying for forgiveness for them, they all relate to this category of disbelievers which had intentionally denied their messenger, and as a result, this was a form of punishment that was given to them. So, another important institute of the Farai school is that we have to understand the subject matter of the Quran, and if we don't give this subject matter enough importance, we will surely end up in misinterpreting some of the verses of the Quran, and we actually conducting certain things, doing certain things which are the sole prerogative of God's messengers. Then we also took a look at the arrangement of the Quran. So as far as the arrangement of the Quran is concerned, we saw how the Farai scholars, they divide the Quran into 7 chapters, and each chapter has certain features which we discussed. And we discussed most of the features last time, and we saw that how each chapter has a theme, just as a surah has a theme, and each chapter begins with one or more Meccan surah and end with also one or more Medinan surah. And the sequence in every chapter is always chronological, it's always historical. So in each chapter, the surah which comes first was necessarily revealed before the next surah. But this is only in the case of a single chapter. You just cannot continue this sequence in the next chapter, because the next chapter would begin with the Meccan surah. Today we're going to pursue and take this matter to its finale, I would say, its climax. And inshallah, from the next session, we'll begin the textual study of the Quran in more detail by starting off with Surah Fatiha. So one important area which is of paramount importance that we need to also gauge while we study the Quran through the Farahi approach is that all these chapters, these 7 chapters, they depict the stages of the prophetic mission in some form or the other, some period or the other. So one broad division of these phases that we all know and we are well acquainted of is the Meccan and the Medinan division. So that is something that we all know, that surahs which were revealed in Mecca, they are called Meccan surahs, and surahs which are revealed in Medina, they are called Medinan surahs. We also know that the temperament and the tone of both these surahs, or those categories of surahs, is quite distinct. So the Meccan surahs, they are more short, they jolt and shake a person, they bring them to a certain point and answer their criticisms. The Medinan surahs, on the other hand, you'll find that they are more detailed. They discuss more things which relate to the people of the book, and because of the fact that they had already been recipients of previous books and a whole series of messengers had come to them, so therefore their arguments are also answered, their objections are answered, their arguments or arguments against their objections are there also proffered. So this is how these surahs progress in a chapter. So today we are going to look at one particular area of this surah arrangement of these 7 chapters, and that is that how do these 7 chapters taken individually, how are the surahs in themselves divided into Meccan and Medinan surahs, and how within the Meccan and Medinan surahs and within the Meccan and the Medinan period there are phases, and these phases evolve. I mean, the first phase is the initial phase, the second phase is something in which the first phase concludes and then the next phase begins. So it's like a climax which is undertaken, and there is a linear progression. If you will see that all these surahs, they have a very, very nuanced and a very specific area in which they would deliver the message of the Prophet or the Quran to the addressees which are just before them. So if you take a look at the screen which is being displayed before you, these are the 5 phases of the Meccan surahs. So the 5 phases of the Meccan surahs, they are important to understand in order to appreciate the tone of the surah, in order to appreciate the area in which a surah falls. So thus, for example, phase 0 is the phase in which everything started off. The Prophet was commissioned. So the only surah which belongs to this phase is Surah Fatiha, and that is the surah which we have discussed elsewhere also, and inshallah we'll discuss in our next session, was the surah from which the Quran's revelation began. It is generally understood that it is Surah Iqra, or the first 5 verses of Surah Iqra. So this is a misconception. In fact, it has become famous because of certain narratives. Otherwise, a majority of the exegetes of the Quran, they agree to the fact and agree on the fact that the first revealed surah was actually, or the first revelation in fact, was Surah Fatiha. So that was the surah, or that is the surah in which the Prophet has been commissioned. He has been given the responsibility to take forth this message from the Quran, to first of all seek guidance from the Almighty. So therefore, if you just recall those words of Surah Fatiha, that if you imagine yourself being placed in that era, you will find that the Jews and the Christians, they had lost the guidance of God. And people were at crossroads. Before the advent of Prophet Muhammad himself, as we know from certain historical narratives, that there were people who would cling to the curtains of the Kaaba and would say that we would like to seek the truth, but we are not being able to find the truth, because now we find two extremes. The people of the book, they are not only have grudges against each other, but they have gone to two extremes. And that is why the Quran says that the first surah, when it describes those two deviant groups, one of them is the Maghzub alayhim, which means that they earn the wrath of the Almighty, and the other ones are Zaleen, the people who had gone astray. And any student of the Quran will tell you that the way Christians and Jews of the times of the Prophet Muhammad are mentioned in other parts of the Quran, it is quite unmistakable that the word Al-Maghzub alayhim actually refers to the Jews, and Zaleen actually refers to the Christians. So basically, in the era of the Prophet Muhammad, if you imagine yourself standing there, mankind is in that thirst in which it is inviting God's guidance. The Prophet himself is, of course, there, and he himself is deeply connected to God, and he himself is one of the main, or if not the real person, who is crying out for that guidance. And Surah Fatiha is something which actually is emanating from his tongue and requesting God to please guide us. We are standing at a crossroads, and we know that there's going to be a day of judgment. We know that as far as God is concerned, He is looking after all of us, but then detailed guidance has been lost in this rigmarole of these two extreme groups. So this is the first phase in which the Prophet was commissioned. The next phase is the phase that we call Insar. Insar is a word that I think most of you would have heard, and it actually literally means warning, to deliver warning. So the Prophet would warn his addressees, his family. In fact, he started off with his family, and the word Insar actually refers to the fact that he warned his family of what's going to take place in the hereafter. They should mend their ways. Remember, the Prophet's family, his own tribe, his own larger family of families, the Bani Ishmael, the Ishmaelites, all of them were deeply involved in idolatry. And this is, it did not start off with idolatry. We know that the Ishmaelites, they were monotheists. If we trace history, we know that it was sometime, some 100 years ago, before the Prophet's arrival, that this actually took place, that idols were placed in the Kaaba, and slowly this tradition of monotheism got transformed into polytheism. So in the phase of warning, what the Prophet does, or what the Prophet did, and we shall see this as we go along studying the Quran, that he started off with warning his people. And the exact opposite, of course, of warning is glad tidings. So the reason that the word Insar, or warning, is stressed in the Quran, as opposed to the glad tidings or the positive aspect, is that primarily the Quran tells us that as far as the right path is concerned, you already know about it. And when you know about it and you're deviating from that right path, it is like you're denying your conscience. So therefore, it is the Quran, the final revelation, which is jolting you, which is shaking you, that come back to the path of your own conscience and seek that detailed guidance. So the first phase of the prophetic mission is called Insar, or warning, and it was primarily related to warning and admonishing his close relatives, his immediate people. I mean, there are people around him, like his own tribe. So remember, today we are living in an urban society, and we have lost connection, or we cannot simply imagine how rural societies are, or generally they behaved. And rural society, as was the case with Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam's own society, a family, was very well knit. Not only the family was well knit, there was a whole fraternity of a tribe that was present. So the Prophet took upon himself, as you will see from the Quran, to shake and jolt them, to warn them that please remember that there is a day of accountability that is going to come. So the warning is regarding the day of accountability, that the day of accountability for my nation, the Prophet would say, is in this world. So your reckoning is going to come in this world. And it shall continue when you will be put to sleep in the form of death. It will continue in the land of Barzakh, and it will continue in the hereafter. So this accountability was something for which the Almighty had commissioned Prophet Muhammad. He had called him for this purpose. The second phase of Prophet Muhammad's mission, again, which belonged to the Meccan era, was, it's a more enhanced form of warning that is called by the Quran as Insar. And although the way these words are used in Surah Muzammil, which actually explicitly points to this phase in which enhanced warning was something that was a forerunner. And when Surah Mudassir, you'll find, as we will study that later on, inshallah, that how the Prophet was addressed and he was said, "Kum fa anzir," stand up and give warning in an enhanced way. Don't go to other people, knock at their doors, tell them that there is something that is amiss. Tell them that you have lost the voice of your conscience. Tell them to come back to your own conscience. Tell them that divine guidance is something that is now descending upon them after such a big gap of two millenniums. And the last time they heard from a prophet was Prophet Ishmael. So it was this enhanced warning which the Prophet Muhammad delivered in his second phase. So it's in fact the third phase. So the first phase was his commissioning. The second phase was warning confined to his immediate circle. And in the third phase, this warning actually came, it spread, and it took the shape of a movement, I would say. And the whole of Mecca, the tribes of Mecca which were present, the sub-tribes which were present, the other fraternities which were present, and primarily they were all idolaters. So to them, the Prophet took his message. And as you will see when we study the Quran, how minutely he would go to people, or at times he would narrate the Quran or narrate the revelation that would be descending on him in the Holy Kaaba, and people would gather around him and listen to him, and they would present their objections, and the Prophet would wait for the Almighty's answer, and then at a later instant he would even answer those objections and questions. So you will see a lot of questions being asked by people as a result of what the Prophet would say. And they are cited in the Quran. Even today, the citation is there. And then the Prophet answers them, of course, through divine revelation. So this enhanced warning, or this Inzar-e-Am phase, is something which actually alarmed the idolaters a lot. Because as long as the Prophet remained amongst his family members, amongst his immediate circle, it was something that they tolerated. Although this is something, they knew that this is something which is going to increase, but until that time, you'll find that this was confined to a certain circle. But when the Prophet increased his circle of warning, he went to different people, and also it started to affect people. It really told them that yes, there is this truth that is now being conveyed to them. It was in these circumstances, for example, that Bilal, anhu, the way he was punished, the way he was put to those heinous forms of punishment. Ammar bin Yasir, the way he was tied, all his four limbs were tied to four camels, and then those camels were made to run in opposite directions, and it simply tore apart his body. So it was in these circumstances when the Quraysh realized that now the Prophet, his mission is being accepted by people, that they reacted. So there was almost no reaction in the warning phase, in the Inzar phase. But in the Inzar-e-Am phase, the enhanced warning phase, there was a tremendous reaction. And that reaction actually was something which was a very natural outcome. It was something that the Prophet was perhaps expecting as well, because he knew that the more he goes and knocks at them, especially their leaders, of course we know that the Prophet would address their leaders. He would not go to the common man in the first instance. He would go and talk to their leaders like leaders like Abu Jahl, leaders like Utbah, like Shaiba, like Abu Lahab, and he would say that this is what is going on. And as you would know from history and from the Prophet's own biography, how closely related these all people were. I mean, all of these people towards whom the Prophet was, I mean, he would go and knock at their doors and they would come to him. They were like family to him. And as soon as he actually started to preach monotheism, it was something that really made them annoyed. They became very angry. And they even offered certain compromises. And he said that if you stop taking the name of one God and you compromise with us, we are going to just make you one of our big ones, our leader. And the Prophet, of course, had no compromise in mind. He said it cannot be any compromise between monotheism and polytheism. So this struggle actually went on for a long time. And it was in this struggle, as I said, that the reaction of the Quraysh became enhanced. And the more it became enhanced, the more did the Prophet push. And he was actually told by the Almighty to expand his efforts. And as I referred to earlier on, that the Quran has actually assigned the Prophet this mission, and he told, the Quran has informed the Prophet that you have to be strong from inside. So if you study the Quran, you'll find out that the prayer of the Tahajjud was imposed on the Prophet, or he was asked to pray for the Tahajjud prayer in a very regular way. In this particular phase, the third phase, the enhanced warning phase, because the Quran tells us that in order to counter your enemy, not only in the field, but mentally, you have to be a strong person. So this mental strength can only be obtained through a strong God connection. And the greatest way to enhance that God connection is the Tahajjud prayer. So we know, Inna sanulqi alayka qawlun saqila. The Quran tells us in Surah Muzammil that the Almighty addressed the Prophet and said that very soon that I'm going to burden you with a heavy word. And the very next surah announces that heavy word, that, okay, rise and give warning. Kum fa'anzir wa rabbaka fakabbir wa sayabaka fatahir. So these are so magnificent and beautiful words that really, really stir a person. And now we move on to the fourth phase of the Prophet's mission, and that is conclusive communication. I think that most of you who have heard about the approach of the Frahi scholars, for them, this term should not be something which is alien to them. This is the phase of Itmamul Hujjah, the phase of conclusive communication. What does that mean? It means that after passing through Insar and Insariyam, warning and enhanced warning, the Almighty, through His Prophet, has now communicated the truth to the addressees, which of course in Mecca were the idolaters, in such a conclusive way, in such an ultimate way, that they were convinced about the truth. So at one place in the Quran, it says regarding the mushrikun or the idolaters, shahidina bil kufr, shahidina ala anfusihim bil kufr, which means that they knew that, they bore witness to their own disbelief. They knew that they are doing something wrong. And in spite of that, they continued with their tirade against the truth. So in the phase of Itmamul Hujjah, what happens is that now the relationship between the believers and disbelievers, the Prophet is told to slowly dissociate yourself from them. And now is the time when they have this final word of being revealed to them. And even if they persist at this instant, then the next phase, which is called the phase of migration and acquittal, al-hijra wal-bara, then the Prophet will dissociate himself from him. He'll just leave him, the nation. And so in the phase of conclusive communication, what happens is that the truth is now, there's no doubt about the truth by that time. During the Insar phase and the Insariyam phase, the truth had been delivered in various ways. For example, questions were asked and answers were given. Objections were raised and answers were given. Dialogue took place. The Prophet was mocked at. He was made fun of. And then it also happened that in this phase, then that a lot of these questions which were answered became a means of actually convincing a lot of people to accept the truth. And we know that although the Quraysh ultimately, when they did accept the truth, it was very late in the Medinan period, but it was this period which had really shaken and jolted them, and they knew that, well, if they're not accepting it in front of the people through their own mouths, then at least they know in their own hearts how wrong they are. So conclusive communication means that the truth has been delivered in such an ultimate way that they are left with no excuse except arrogance to deny it. And one important feature of this conclusive communication is that even a prophet of God is someone who does not know when this has happened. He does not simply know that the truth has now been conclusively delivered. It is God who informs his messenger. So remember, when we are talking about these phases, we are talking about these phases regarding Prophet Muhammad. And something very similar also happened to the previous prophets. And especially in the case of Itmam al-Hujjah, which means conclusive communication, the Almighty always tells his messenger that, remember, it is me or it is I who's going to tell you when the truth has been completely delivered. Because this involves the intention of the heart. You just cannot decide for your own self. That in this phase, when the truth has been ultimately delivered, the decision that this conclusive communication has been done always comes from God. And once one of his prophets, like the prophet Jonah, decided for himself to leave his nation, the Almighty actually admonished him and he punished him for that. And on a very similar note, when Abraham saw that his nephew Lot's nation was to be destroyed as angels had come to visit him, and when he asked that, what's your mission now? And they said that they are now going to go and destroy Lot's nation. Abraham actually, in a very affectionate way, argued with God and said, God, please do not punish them. Maybe there are 50 righteous people. And God said, no, they're no longer 50 righteous people. And he said, maybe there are 40, maybe there are 30. So you'll find this dialogue in the Bible in which Abraham in the book of Genesis is actually trying to convince the Almighty that please give them more time. And the Almighty is insisting that their time is up. So the point that I'm making here is that this conclusive communication is something which only God knows. Even the prophets of God do not know this. So if this is such a critical thing, then today when there is no prophet, today when there is no communication with God, how can we ever think that the truth we have we totally conveyed to the disbelievers around us? Such is the important, such is the importance to understand this, that this issue of conclusive communication is solely known to God. It is only after that does he pronounce punishment for his people or for the nation, because they know and they out of their own accord deliberately deny the truth. And even prophets of God, they don't know, because as I said, deliberate denial is something which is always it springs from the heart, and only God knows this, what is in a person's heart. So always we have to understand this, that this issue of Itmam al-Hujjah, it is only related to how God lets us know about it. Today, in the absence of any messenger of God, there is absolutely no means if this Itmam al-Hujjah or conclusive communication has taken place for people or not. It could have taken place for certain people, but we just cannot demarcate them, because this is a decision which only God can tell. And he used to tell these things to his messengers when the institution of divine revelation was still intact. Finally, viewers, we have the fifth phase, and that is the phase of migration and acquittal. Now, this is the phase in which the prophets of God are told to dissociate from their nations, to announce their acquittal, and just leave them, because now, once the phase of Itmam al-Hujjah had finished, now there is nothing left in them. And it was precisely at this instant that Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, in his own times, he left Mecca. So his flight from Mecca to Medina was not a journey in which he did something out of his own ijtihad or his own opinion, or because he was afraid of something might happen or something might befall him. It was at the behest of the Almighty that the Almighty had ordered Prophet Muhammad that now enough has been done with these idolaters. You just need to make your way out from this city now, and now you will be given the charge of a new city near Mecca, which is called Medina, of course, and from there on a new mission will start, which is, of course, something which relates to his decision and delivery regarding the people of the book. So this is how we see that these are the 5 important phases through which the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ's life passed in Mecca. So we just talked about the Meccan period as yet. And just to give you how important this is, to realize whether a surah lies in the Itmam al-Hujjah phase, or whether it lies in the acquittal phase, or wherever it does it lie. Just let me give you one example to make you see how important it is. You must have heard of Surah Kafirun, and the very last verse it says, Lakum dinukum waliya deen, which means to you your religion and to me mine. Now, generally people take this verse as a verse of tolerance, in which people say that, well, look what the Quran is telling these people, these idolaters. He's telling them, well, you follow your way, I'm going to follow my way. So it of course means that the Almighty is allowing them to follow what they would think as the right way. He's not forcing them to do anything. Now, if you study the context of the surah and you study the placement of the surah, remember the surah is placed, as we shall see when we go along studying the Quran, in the migration and acquittal phase, the fifth phase. And when the migration and acquittal phase takes place, and in that particular phase, when someone like God tells you that you go your own way and I'll go my own way, then it is not a sentence of tolerance. It is actually a huge threat, which means just wait and see what's going to happen with you. So you see, just one sentence, when it is interpreted as a general sentence, as out of context sentence, as a sentence without any regard to the phases of the Prophet's mission, you will interpret it to be a sentence which gives you a tolerant view of religion. But when you place it in the surah in which it was revealed, and the surah itself was a surah which was revealed in the migration and acquittal phase. Now, the Prophet is announcing his dissociation. So when he is saying, to you your religion and to me mine, it's not that he's saying, okay, do what you like and I'm going to do what I like. No, he's saying, okay, now wait and see what's going to happen for you. So it's like a huge threat to them. It's just conveying them, do whatever you like, but then wait for God's decision and wait for God's judgment. So it's more of a threat than a statement of tolerance. This was a point that I wanted to make so that we can understand how important it is to understand these phases as they go along the Prophet's life. Let's move on to the next part, and that is the life which the Prophet spent in his ministry as the Almighty had appointed him, and this was his term in Medina. So here his addressees were, as we've discussed, generally the people of the book. And yes, they were the tribes of Aus and Khazraj also, which belonged to the Bani Ishmael. So they were idolaters as well in Medina, but primarily they were the people of the book. So in Medina, those elaborate phases did not take place. Why? The answer is that earlier on, remember we had discussed that no prophet had come amongst the Ishmaelites, and they needed elaborate guidance, and they had to be passed through all these phases, because gradually they were given the truth. But as far as the people of the book are concerned, or they were concerned, they already knew. They were already waiting for a prophet. The Quran tells us that they found the name of the final messenger written in their own books, and they were waiting for that. And we also find in the Quran many surahs which tell us that once Prophet Muhammad had arrived, many of them accepted faith, and they all referred to those verses of the Bible which told them that yes, a final prophet of God is to come, and now that he has come, they accepted faith. So the first phase, or I would say which occupies a better part of the Medinan phase, is what we call Taskiya and Tathir in Arabic, which means purification of deeds and practices of Muslims. This actually means that because Muslims were chosen, they were primarily chosen to punish the disbelievers of Mecca. They had to be given a little training for that, not just a little training, quite a lot of training. So their deeds were purified, their practices were purified, and they were concentrated upon as far as these phases are concerned. So as far as the Muslims are concerned, or the believers are concerned, it was a period of training in which they were organized, in which they were disciplined in the form of a group, so that if attack was to be launched on the city of Mecca, they were organized as a very, very specific group. And at the same time, the people of the book, they were addressed, and they were told that their time is running out. And we know that it was also in this phase that the Prophet Muhammad, around the 5th or 6th Hijrah, wrote letters to 12 neighboring countries of Arabia. I mean, they were like on the periphery of Arabia. They were just surrounding Arabia. It's like being on the borders. And they were told that their time is also up, or it's going to be up very soon. The prophet of the final messenger has arrived. His final reckoning, the way he's going to deliver it, is now going to take place very soon. They also have a chance to come and visit the prophet and see if they would like to find have any questions to get them answered. So it was well after the prophet had passed away, or when this attack was launched. But remember, this information was actually divulged to them very earlier on in his in the 5th or 6th Hijrah. So it was like 6 or 7 years after that they were given this time to reflect. They were given this time to come and discuss with the prophet, and at the same time see how that divine reckoning was taking place in the land of Arabia. But because remember, these were the territories which were on the periphery of Arabia. And then in the phase 2, the final onslaught, which is the phase in which reward and punishment took place, the way it takes place or will take place on the day of judgment. So final punishment was delivered, and it was told that idolaters would be put to death if they don't accept faith. They don't have any other choice. As far as the disbelievers among the people of the book are concerned, they shall be allowed to live on their own religion, but they will have to submit to the Islamic rule and give jizya. The hypocrites were also given a very final warning, and they were told that if they don't mend their ways, their fate will also be no different. And of course, we know that a better part of Surah Tawbah, which is the surah in which this divine reckoning is announced. So this surah is a surah in which this final judgment has taken place. So I have just presented before you a summary of how these Meccan and Medinan phases have developed, or they are reflected in the Quran. Now, very briefly, I'm going to just let you know how these surahs are. The way the Quran encapsulates these surahs of various phases. So remember, the commissioning phase was Surah Fatiha, or the first phase, and that the only surah which was revealed in that commissioning phase was Surah Fatiha. But as we go on to the next phase, which is the Insar, so the surahs which were revealed in the Insar phase, I'm just going to outline them for you in a nutshell. Of course, in more detail, we'll be studying them once we go through the Quran. But clearly you can see that these Insar surahs, they have been highlighted, and they have been made bold in the illustration before you. So in chapter number 7, 68, 67, 68 to 72, these are the surahs which were revealed in the era of Insar. So this was the time when, as I just mentioned earlier on, that the Prophet was talking to his own immediate family and to his immediate tribesmen. And these were the surahs which were revealed in chapter number 7. And you can see that they are 6 surahs. In chapter number, after 7, the slide has gone reverse, so I think I'm just going to read it from below. In the 6th chapter, because remember when we discussed the sequence of arrangement, we saw that the climax occurs in chapter number 2. So we're just going to go from 7 to 6 to 5 to 4 to 3 to 2 when we're studying the Meccan phase. So as far as the 7th chapter is concerned, these are the 4 surahs in which there are Insar surahs. And interestingly, you'll find that there are no other Insar-e-Am surahs in the whole of the Quran. So the only chapter which contains Insar-e-Am surahs, or surahs which depict that enhanced warning, are these 6 surahs. That's all. And a total of them, and you'll not find them anywhere in any other chapter. So there's just one chapter which discusses the Insar surahs. Now remember, the next phase was the Insar-e-Am, or the enhanced warning phase. This is found in 4 chapters, you can see. So the 4 chapters are 4, 5, 6 and 7. So in chapter number 4, from 25 to 30, they form the Insar-e-Am surahs. In chapter number 5, we just have 2 Insar-e-Am surahs. So when I say Insar-e-Am surahs, what does it mean? It means surahs which were revealed in the Insar-e-Am phase. The Insar surahs are surahs which were revealed in the Insar phase. So you see, this is important to give you a complete picture of the Quran, because as I said, it's not arranged in a linear fashion. It is arranged in a very, very specific fashion. So we discussed about the Insar surahs. There are just 6 of them, and you'll just find them in chapter number 7. If you now go to the Insar-e-Am surah, which is of course the next phase, you'll find them right here before you, that chapter number 4 has these 6 surahs, chapter number 5 has just 2, 34 and 35, And chapter number 6 has 50, 51, and right up to 56, which is 7 surahs. And chapter number 7 also has Insar surahs, and therefore you can see from 73, which is Surah 73, to Surah 94, these are the Insar surahs. And as I said earlier on, if you total the Insar surahs, there are just 6. But look at the Insar surahs, they are 37. So you see, initially the warning was it was so confined, and later on the circle of that warning was enhanced. And now we have 37 surahs speaking of that enhanced warning, all these distributed in the way that I have just shown. Some of them in chapter number 2, others in chapter number 3, still others in chapter number 4, then we have some in chapter number 5, and I'm just going backwards. So we have the Insar surahs in chapter number 4, in chapter number 5, in chapter number 6, and chapter number 7. So this again shows how that it is not that all the phases of the Prophet's mission are discussed in all the chapters. Clearly, this is not the case. So at times, you'll just find either the Insar or the Insar surahs. Or maybe you'll find Insar and the Itmam al-Hujjah surahs. Or you'll find a combination of all those three. I'm going to just illustrate that before you. But I know it's slightly, you have to apply your mind, because this is how we have to understand the Quran deeply, that how this progression of surahs has an impact on the understanding and interpretation of the Quran. So, as far as the Insar surahs are concerned, these are 37. Now, let's move on to the next phase. So, remember the next phase was the Itmam al-Hujjah phase. So, if you look at the Itmam al-Hujjah phase, this is also a phase in which that final ultimate warning was just being finished and it was being delivered. So, you'll find chapter number 2 speaking of that. So, 6 and 7, they belong to the Itmam al-Hujjah phase. And in chapter number 3, you'll find from 10 to 21, these are the surahs which belong to the Itmam al-Hujjah phase. In chapter number 4, we just find 2 surahs, which is 31 and 32. In chapter number 5, you'll find 3 surahs which belong to the Itmam al-Hujjah phase, which is 36, 37, and 38. And in chapter number 7, you'll find from 95 to 106, these are the surahs which were revealed in the Itmam al-Hujjah phase. So, all these surahs are distributed in various chapters of the Quran. Please do concentrate that we are talking about the 5 phases of the Meccan period. We are talking about those 5 phases. Now we are placing every surah of the Quran in a particular phase that fall in those 5 phases. So I've just discussed how the Insar surahs fall in those chapters. Then I've discussed how the Insar surahs fall. Now we're discussing how the Itmam al-Hujjah surahs are placed within these chapters. So the bold letters that you can see on your screen, they represent those surahs which belong to that particular period. So you can see that a total of 31 surahs. So remember, it's not that always the surahs are equally, they're not of equal length. In fact, there is a substantial difference. So don't go at the number. If you find that this 31 number is lesser than 37 and maybe the corpus of 31 is lesser than 37, that's not necessarily true. Because as I said, the surahs are not of equal length. This is just to give you an idea that how a complete surah revolves around a particular theme and ends on that theme, so that you can have an idea how these phases progress in the Quran. So remember, there were 6 Insar surahs, 37 Insar surahs, and 31 Itmam al-Hujjah surahs. How they have been distributed in the Quran in various chapters. Now we come to the phase which is called the Hijrah wa Baraat phase. So this Hijrah wa Baraat phase, you'll find, has a total of 16 surahs, and it is distributed in 3 chapters of the Quran. So chapter number 3, you can find just 2 surahs which belong to the Hijrah and Baraat. Remember Hijrah and Baraat? Hijrah and Baraat, which means migration and acquittal, is the phase in which the Prophet is about to leave his people. Now their time is up, and this is how he's going to address his people in a very conclusive way. So in chapter number 5, you'll find that from Surah 39 to 46, they belong to the Itmam al-Hujjah phase. And finally, in chapter number 7, you'll see that from Surah 107 to Surah 112, these are the surahs which belong to the Hijrah wa Baraat, or the migration and acquittal phase, and they are a total of 16 surahs. So you can have a fair idea of how the prophetic mission is progressing in these surahs and how things are going in a certain manner. Now we take up the Medinan phase. So remember, the Meccan phase is more elaborate, it's more discursive, it's more you have to nuance it, you have to divide it in a very discrete way. But remember, the Medinan phase is something in which we have the tathir phase, which means the purification phase in which Muslims are being organized, and then we have the reward and punishment phase. So if you look at the tathir wa tathir phase, you will find that it has a total of 15 surahs. And remember, these are the Medinan surahs that we're talking about. How are they distributed? Right here in front of you. So chapter number 1 has 2, 3, and 4, and 5 as those surahs which are revealed in this phase. In chapter number 3, we just have one surah, and that is surah number 24. It belongs to the migration, it belongs to the Tazkiyah wa Tathir phase, which means that this is the phase in which Muslims were being given those, they were instructed they were being organized as a polity. So if you just recall, remember Surah Nur? This is a surah in which punishments, like the punishment for adultery, the punishment for blaming someone for adultery, the incident of ifk. So recall that these were the incidents which are mentioned in surah number 24. And this is the surah in which Muslims are also being prepared, as we know, because in the Tazkiyah and the Tathir phrase, believers are prepared for the final onslaught. So the Sharia directives are also given in these particular surahs for this very reason. And then you can see in chapter 4, 5, and 6, the surahs which belong to the Tazkiyah wa Tathir phase are in chapter number 4 is 33, in chapter number 5 is 47, 48, and 49, and chapter number 6 you'll find from 57 to 66. These are the surahs which belong to this phase. And finally in chapter number 7 you'll find 113 and 114, which is of course Surah Falak and Surah Nas. They belong to this phase in which Tazkiyah and Tathir, which means the deeds and practices of Muslims, were purified, and they come to a total of 15 surahs. And finally, we have the final onslaught phase, and you'll find that this final onslaught phase just has 2 surahs, because this was the time when the decision was about to be announced, and that was chapter number 2. And remember, Surah Tawbah lies at the pinnacle of the Quran in which that decision was ultimately announced. So that final onslaught phase basically is surah number 8 and 9. So surah number 8 prepares the believers for that final onslaught, and surah number 9 actually announces that final onslaught. And so we have just 2 surahs in which that final onslaught is announced. So you can see that there are 5 Meccan phases moving in a linear way. Not all the chapters depict all the phases, but yes, different chapters depict different phases. And then we have the Medinan phase, in which we have 2 distinct divisions. And you find that the content of the Medinan Quran is much less than the Meccan Quran, as you can see, simply because, as we've discussed this time earlier before, that the people of the book had already been recipients of a previous book. So if you have this in mind, I'm sure when you receive these slides, if you are able to find some time, please go through them again, because this needs some serious study. And if you are able to apply your mind on this sequence and the way these things progress, you'll find how the evolution takes place in the Meccan surahs. Look at the evolution. So if you look at this evolution, you'll find that in chapter number 1, this is how things are progressing. You're just getting 1, then you're getting 6 and 7. So as far as chapter number 1 is concerned, it is a chapter in which the Prophet was commissioned in the very first surah. Chapter number 2 is a chapter in which there are just 2 types of surahs. There are 3 types of surahs. In fact, let me come back. There are 2 types: Insar Am to Itmam al-Hujjah. So remember, I just said that not all the chapters depict all the phases of the Prophet's movement. So this is what I was talking about. For example, chapter number 1 discusses, if you look at the Meccan part, it just discusses the basic phase. So remember, we're talking about the evolution of the Meccan surahs. Just forget about the Medinan surahs for the time being. Concentrate on the Meccan ones, which is the green portion. So chapter number 1 just tells us about the first phase, which was the first phase in which the Prophet was commissioned for this purpose. Chapter number 2 has just 2 phases depicted, which is the phase of Insar Am and the phase of Itmam al-Hujjah. Chapter number 3 has also 2 phases. But which are these 2 phases? Itmam al-Hujjah and Hijra wa Bara. Chapter number 4, in fact, has also 2 phases. And you can clearly see that these are the phases which have been depicted, which is phase number 2 and phase number 3, the Insar phase and the Insar Am phase. In chapter number 5, on the contrary, you'll find it much more richer than the other chapters. So it has a depiction of 3 phases: phase 2, phase 3, and phase 4. From Insar Am to Itmam al-Hujjah to Hijra. So we have phase 2, phase 3, and phase 4 in chapter number 5. In chapter number 6, you just have one phase, and that is the Insar phase. So remember, we're talking about just the Meccan period. So in the Meccan period, chapter number 6 has just one phase, and that is the Insar phase. And perhaps the richest of all chapters is chapter number 7, because it mentions 4 phases, from phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 3 to phase 4, which is Insar to Insar to Itmam al-Hujjah to Hijrah. So you'll find 4 phases being covered in the 7th chapter. On the contrary, the next richest phase, as you saw earlier on, was chapter number 5, which had 3 phases. The rest mostly have 2 phases. And chapter number 1, just has that commissioning surah. So you see, this is how the content of the Meccan surahs evolve in the whole of the Quran. And it'll need some application from your mind when you are able to find some time to look at this. And this is how the evolution of this Meccan phase actually takes place. That as far as the Quran is concerned, it is a beautiful collection. The way this arrangement has been made is not a haphazard collection. It is such a deeply rooted, meaningful connection in which you'll find the surahs being scientifically arranged and depicting one or the other or the third phase of the Prophet's mission, each concluding in a Medinan surah, each beginning with a Meccan surah, and then within the confines of the Meccan and the Medinan surah, if you place a particular verse and a particular surah in the whole chapter, and if you sever that context, you'll find opposite at times interpretations resulting, simply because you have not placed the surah in its right phase. So such is the importance of placing the surah in its correct phase, that you will not be able to understand, or we will not be able to understand, the tone in which something is being revealed. As I just gave you the example of Lakum Dinukum Waliya Deen, we will end up thinking that maybe Islam is giving us this message of tolerance, that okay, you follow your religion and I follow my religion. So this is just one example. Otherwise, you can see as we go along in the Quran that simply the tone, the way things they get addressed, how it changes and how some stress is either added or it is taken away. So I'm going to end my talk here. Inshallah, from the next session, our introduction ends today. From the next session, we'll start off with Surah Fatiha and see how some of the things that we have studied today apply to Surah Fatiha. And then, of course, inshallah, we'll take a deep dive into the Quran and start off with Surah Baqarah. So if you have any questions, it's the time. I'm there to answer the questions.
Thank you, and Assalamu alaikum, and thank you for the lecture. This was very helpful. So I have a question on the 7th chapter, or the 7-group arrangement of the Quran, which is followed by the Farahi school, which, as you say, is critical to get to the correct understanding of the Quran. So Islahi finds this, evidence for this arrangement in, 1587, which you mentioned in your last lecture. And then also in a hadith where the Prophet said that Quran was revealed in accordance with the 7 Ahruf. And also elsewhere I've read that, he also quoted that the Prophet used to recite certain surahs in pairs in ritual prayers, as evidence for this arrangement. So my question is that if that's the case, then why was this arrangement quote unquote discovered by Farahi or Islahi? Why was it not known by the companions, and why was it not reflected in the traditional exegetical work that took place, in the 2nd or 3rd century Hijri? And then also we see that, in late antiquity and even today, some numbers denote plentitude and not so much an exact number. 7 being one of them. So we have 7 skies, 7 days, 7 nights, and maybe 7 aruf. So what's the reason that in this case, in the case of this verse and this hadith, the number is taken literally and not as you would in case of 7 skies?
Right. So as far as the first question is concerned, I think I did answer this in my first talk last week, and I said that, well, when you find Farahi Sahab stumbling upon these groups or these chapters, by the way, his own discovery was that the Quran has 9 chapters. So it was Islahi actually who differed with him, and he came up with this idea of 7 chapters. But nonetheless, the question that why is it that they were not discovered earlier on, I think I have tried to make this clear very in my last talk as well, that you see that the Quran very earlier on, as soon as the Prophet had left this world, barring the first couple of centuries, it never became an object of direct deliberation. So very earlier on, in the times of Imam Shafi'i, who lived in the 2nd century, it was taken for granted that the right way to study the Quran is to enter the Quran through the tunnel of Hadith. So discovering the Quran or pondering over the Quran or understanding the Quran from the text of the Quran, it very rapidly disappeared after the companions of the Prophet and perhaps the Tabi'un and the Taba Tabi'un. And in the 2nd or 3rd century, the norm was that more stress was laid on Hadith, history, fiqh, seerah, linguistics, and many other disciplines which, of course, were developed. And this was taken as a cardinal principle that if you have to understand the Quran, you just should not should not do it with your own intellect, because that's going to mislead you. The right way to interpret the Quran is to go to the Hadith. And that is precisely why you can see that this verse of Sabam al-Masani, or this 1587 that you just quoted, it is understood by our traditional scholars in a different way, because they are not coming from directly understanding that verse of the Quran. What they are doing is they are going to a Hadith and they are saying that, look, this is what the Hadith says about 1587. This is just one point that I'm making. Otherwise, this is the case with almost every single surah of the Quran or every single verse of the Quran, that people have stopped, and they stopped very earlier on in our history in applying their minds to understand the Quran.
So, I mean, the Hadith science and as such did not really take hold until the 2nd century, you might say.
Right.
So, so if this was, and then, we read about the fact that there was a chronological order of revelation of Quran, and then it was arranged in this, in this order by the Prophet. So obviously there was a lot of, thought given behind the ordering of the verses. So how was it that, this theme, which was so critical to that order, was just missed, in that time, in terms of the, education of the companions, or the, the transmission by them?
So I think that there's no reason to believe that they were not aware of this. I think the Prophet himself, the companions, and even their students were quite aware of this, in my estimation. It was because of the fact that a lot of things that they would say, they never got transmitted, or they were left out, or they thought it was something which was very naturally understood. So you see, what happened was that because of the fact that the understanding of the Quran, as we come to know of it today, was made to entirely base itself on how a Hadith treats a Quranic verse. And so a particular knowledge of a companion's understanding of a particular verse, that did not matter unless, of course, we didn't have a prophetic Hadith. So I do think that what has happened earlier on is that the Sahaba, perhaps, and even their students, were pretty clear about what this verse meant. The only thing was that in later generations, because they found a Hadith which says differently, that Hadith, it took preponderance. Notwithstanding the fact that it doesn't mean that the Sahaba or the companions never had that opinion. The only thing is perhaps their opinion was never narrated, or it never, had the chance to become a part of our knowledge. So that's what I think about what happened.
Okay, thank you. My second question was on the number 7 and why it's taken.
Okay, so you see, when you talk about a number connoting a large number, so it's always something which is of linguistics. Linguistics come into play. For example, in the English language, I would use the word 100 for this purpose. I would say, I have told this to you 100 times. I've gone over this 1,000 times. So the words which actually connote a large number, they are fixed in a language. So you just not invent them. 7 is a number which is never used in the English language, and for that matter in any other language, to connote multiplicity. So I would never say that I have told you 7 times to not repeat this, or I have 7 times told you to please come to the class regularly. So the number 7 is never used in most languages, at least in Arabic, in English, and in Urdu, for the purpose of denoting multiplicity. So for multiplicity, the numerals are already decided, and they have been decided by our linguists. So as far as the 7 is concerned, You might say that yes, God seems to have a liking for 7 because yes, there are 7 days and 7 nights, and we have 7 heavens and we have 7 days in a week, etc. But I mean, this is all that we can find. But the thing that we can make out of it is that it's not that 7 is connoting any multiplicity. I mean, it's connoting the exact numeral that it stands for. When God says He created 7 heavens, it means 7, 7. I mean, the number 7. So when the Quran says that it is divided into 7 chapters, it does not refer to any multiplicity because the number 7 is not used for that. It actually refers literally to the 7 number.
Assalamu alaikum, sir. Sir, my question is like the Insar and the periods which you define, it's just for Makkah period or it's also apply on a Medina period?
I think I just described that the as far as the Insar phases are concerned, they just relate to the Meccan phase. For the Medinan phase, we have a new terminology. So we have the Tathir and Tazkiyah phase, which means purifying the practices and deeds of the Muslims, and then we have the reward and punishment phase. So these are the two phases which relate to Medina. As far as warning and enhanced warning is concerned, they are the ones which belong to the Meccan phase only.
Also, sir, like are your lectures are available in Urdu also, like the way you are talking here? Is there any other group you start the same thing in Urdu?
Let me recall. I think there is a series which I taught. It's called Understanding the Quran. If I remembering it correctly, I think it was in Urdu. I think our administration here would correct me if I'm wrong. If I remember as far as I can, that some of these concepts that I've discussed here were discussed in that series as well in Urdu.
Ji, Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Shah.
Walaikum.
Sir, this final onslaught, what is the term that is used in Urdu to represent that?
This is no particular term. I mean, this is a term that I had to coin to reflect a phase. Because if you go to the Farai scholars, they don't actually divide the Medinan phase into any, the Medinan era into any of these phases. This is my understanding of their interpretation. I mean, as far as the phases are concerned, they are more related to the Meccan area because they are very distinct. So as far as the Medinan time of the Prophet's ministry is concerned, you'll find that the way it has been described by these Farai scholars that these are the two distinct phases. I mean, it's either the final phase, which is reward and punishment, or the preparation phase for that.
Indeed, sir, the second question, and I'm sure you'll stop me, Yasin Saab, when he feels I'm going overboard, is when you said that it is only Allah Almighty who explicitly gives the permission to the messenger or orders him to leave,
Right.
and only then.
Right.
In the case of the Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, it was more like an invitation coming from the Medina, the folks in Medina who had accepted Islam, and they invited him for the hijrah.
Mhm.
So was it the fact that Allah ordered him to go? He had to seek permission from Allah that now these guys are inviting me. Should I go or should I not go? Or how would
Actually, the sequence of events, the way it took place, it was, exactly the scheme that God maybe had in His own mind, in His own plan. So because it was like a synchronization between what happened and what God had, planned. So there could be a possibility, that what the Prophet did was accepted by God without any communication because it was actually following His own plan. And we can also not rule out the fact that yes, maybe God Himself communicated this fact to Prophet Muhammad outside of the Quran, because we know that he did communicate a lot of things to the Prophet outside of the Quran. So there are both possibilities. Either there was complete synchronization, or the fact that this was the time when the Almighty informed the Prophet as well.
So it does look like that all these chapters are in a way following a chronology. They are going from a timeline which is moving ahead in time.
Within a chapter, yes, within a chapter. Within a chapter, they are always historical in sequence.
Yeah, that's very insightful. Thank you, sir.
Sir, I have related to the topic of a chapter as described by Javed Ahmed Ghamidi. Does the topic of the chapter depicts the phases of that prophetic mission within that chapter, or the dominant phase on?
It does. I mean, it is placed in that particular phase because of the fact that its own content is something which reflects the whole phase in which it was being placed. For example, if it was placed in the Insar time of the Prophet, so it was not that it was the other way around. It was because the content was reflecting that Insar or Insariyam, whatever the case was. So basically, it's the content of the surah from which we deduce how a particular surah falls in a particular phase and how one phase ends and the other phase starts. And this is the thing that we're going to study, inshallah, as we go along in the Quran, that how we do come to know that a particular phase has ended and the next has started, and how we can be so sure about it. So this is one of the things that, inshallah, we'll try to do when we start studying the Quran.
Pages. Because I studied that in Al-Bayan, it is stated that the third, fourth, and fifth, and sixth chapters have the one topic, and that is Insar and the Tazkiyah or Tazkir. So that skips the intermediate phases.
No. I mean, what he is explaining there is the sequence of the chapters. What makes these chapters come after the other, and how is it that in chapter number 2 we have the pinnacle of the Quran. So, and that is something that I explained in my last lecture, that how the arrangement of the Quran is skewed towards the left, or towards the right, in which we have two chapters belonging to the Medinan period, and we have the rest of the 5 dominantly addressing the idolaters. So when Ghamidi Sahib says that these 5 chapters have the same theme, so they're talking about the theme of those chapters, and when you go along and you read those themes when he has written in detail, once he was describing those chapters, you'll find some additional words in which he describes how particular chapter, when he says it is of Insar or reward and punishment, how exactly are the details. So you'll find those details when you go to those respective chapters. So initially he's just given the broad guideline that this is how the chapters are going to progress vis-a-vis the theme that they have.
So just one last confusion which I have. It isn't like that for example, I started from chapter 7, moved to 6, 5. So during chapter 6, I was going through some phases of the prophetic mission. And for example, I went to phase 4. And in the next chapter 5, I'm again starting from phase 1 or phase 2. So doesn't it cause some confusion that what's happening to a reader like me, a layman?
No, actually, this is something which can cause confusion for all of us. You see, because of the fact we are not used to this sort of arrangement. So as I described earlier on, the arrangement that we are used to is a linear arrangement in which things progress from chapter number 1 to chapter number 10. For example, if I write a book, if it has 10 chapters, the 10th chapter would perhaps be the climax of my book, and things would be moving in a linear fashion. That's how we human beings are acquainted with a book. But because of the fact that this is not a human book, and this itself is the reason that we say that this could not have been produced by human beings, that the way these chapters are arranged is a very unique thing. It's a very unique phenomena. And in fact, to discover this sequence is even more unique. So you see, it's as I said, this is an advanced study of the Quran. If a person does not know the sequence, the way we describe it, nothing will take away the guidance that God generally gives us and I mean for salvation. But when you go deeper in the Quran, as a student of the Quran, these are some of the finer details that actually further add to the wisdom which the Quran tells us. So we have to understand that the Quran does not behave, or it does not, conform to the standards that we are used to. So we are used to headings, we are used to paragraphs, we are used to subheadings. And this is how we write a book. We have exercises, etc. So the Quran is a very unique book in this regard, and you have to make yourself accustomed to the diction of the Quran to make you to make you come closer to the Quran itself. It's an exercise that we all need to do.
So was this also same for the people of that period?
I think because of the fact that the Prophet was there, if you're talking about the earliest of periods, Prophet Muhammad was in his own lifetime, and similarly the Sahaba who were, and as long as they lived, because we know the last Sahabi passed away by the end of the 1st century. Like 100 years or so, this was something that was, verbally transmitted, and people well knew about that. And because of the fact that we don't have knowledge about that, this is something that I'm just drawing as a conclusion. Because as I said, a lot of things, they are there for granted, but they never get transmitted.
Actually, I have two questions. First question is that this arrangement of the chapters and the way you explained last week and this week, the confusion which came into my mind is that it's an advanced study of the Quran. So when you basically, a scholar, actually deduce or discover this arrangement of the chapters, it seems that this is kind of from a scientific point of view, it's a kind of a theory which is applied to Quran and try to understand it correctly. It is possible, like we can say that it is an application of the theory on Quran. It is not coming directly from Quran, that the way it is basically revealed or the way it is arranged.
Contrary, it is directly coming from the Quran. And because some of the scholars have discovered that, so we are going backwards in time. I mean, I am not doing it for the first time, or we are not going on this journey, for the first time. So some scholars, I'm particularly referring to the Farai scholars, they did this exercise and they, derived this arrangement from within the text of the Quran. Now that they have derived it, a person like me who is a student of the Farai scholars, I am able to teach other people that look how they have understood the Quran. So the understanding itself is directly based on the Quran, but once it has been made, now we are going back into that understanding once again, and I'm trying to explain to you that, look, this is how they are going to make their way through the Quran. So remember, we have not even started studying the Quran as yet. So the proof of the pudding lies in its eating, as they say. So once we go to the Quran, we'll test their theory, we'll test all these things that they have said, and we'll see how at least they have come up with this arrangement, with this sequence in different phases. So what I'm doing is we are not conducting a journey afresh. What I'm trying to do is already trying to acquaint you with what these people have done so that we can see what they did. Does it conform? Does it make sense? Do we get convinced regarding it or not?
Okay. Many thanks. And my second question, my second question is that we have we believe that Islam is the religion since Adam. So basically, we have in front of us Bible and different forms of Bible. I know that the Muslim scholars believe that the Bible is not. It has to be understood from the Quranic perspective. But the point is that no Muslim scholar, or at least I'm not aware, that they basically propose or they promote that the Bible should also be read, understood, and then you reach to a level where you can understand Quran as well.
So I think this is not precisely what Ustaz Farai has stated. It's not that it is an essential ingredient to understand the Quran, but yes, it is a very, very supportive ingredient, like hadith literature, like history literature. So this is some of the background material that we have, and some of the things we would not be able to understand from the Quran, because you see, in a lot of verses, the Quran is referring to the Bible. It says on several occasions, it says, go and find Fatu bit Tawrat fatluha. Go and bring the Tawrat and recite what's written in it. Go and see what the Tawrat says. Min ajli zalika katabna ala bani Israel. Because of this incident between Abel and Cain, we ordained the Israelites that and the nafsa bin nafs, that eye for an eye and ear for an ear. So you see the Quran referring to those scriptures and it telling us that, like, the Quran is a furqan, it's a decider of truth and evil for us. The same status was enjoyed by the Torah, and then it gives reference to the Torah, and it says that the promise of God of giving Jannah to the Muslims has been written. Wa'adun alayhi haqqan fit Tawrati wal Injili wal Quran. This is what the Quran says, that this is a promise that I have made and mentioned in the Quran, in the Torah, and in the Injil. So you see, we just cannot miss these verses unless we just blindly read through these verses without understanding them. That on so many occasions, unless, we just, as I said, skip those translations, the Quran is actually referring to live verses of the Torah and the Injil. And unless you go and read them, the verse that is in question might not make, full sense to you. Yes, it would be making something of a sense to you, but the details and the background will only come to you once you go and see what the Torah and Injil have to offer. So any person who has read a translation of the Quran, especially of the first two surahs and Surah Maryam, which is the 19th surah, which particularly talks about the people of the book, you just cannot miss out that how important it is to have a knowledge of the previous scriptures.
Assalamualaikum, Dr. Saleem. My question to you was that as we move forward with the study of the Quran, will we be moving from chapter to chapter and go through the phases chronologically, or will we move like we finish one chapter and then go to the next one?
The latter. The latter. We'll study the Quran in its sequence that we have it today, from Fatiha to An-Nas. And every time we finish a chapter, we'll analyze each chapter in this way, that we'll assign each of the surahs the phase that we think that our Farai scholars have assigned it, and see whether it actually does convince us that it belongs to that surah or that phase or not. So it's like a linear study of the Quran from chapter 1 to 2 and right up to 7.
And another question I had was, like, now that you've highlighted which phase of the Quran was revealed to the Prophet, either in Makkah or Medina. If one was to read it, just to go through the phases, does it make give us some kind of clarity? As in,
It does. Yes, it does. I mean, for example, if you start reading just the Insar surahs, or you just read the Insar surahs, you'll get a very, very, very clear picture of how things and the tone of the Quran was in that particular phase, how things were addressed, how the reaction of the Quraysh was, how the Prophet was going about doing his mission. So every chapter, every surah, the way it has been discussed, you'll find, if you study, then in a way that you group all the Insar surahs, you group all the Insar surahs and study them as a whole, it will give you a very, very enhanced picture of the Quran.
Okay, yeah, that's what I wanted to know. So we can do it independently. It doesn't really, it's not incorrect to do that.
No, certainly not. That you can do as an academic exercise.
Okay, thank you so much. Appreciate that.
Thank you so much. Next question is from Mr. Akram Bhatti. Akram Sahab, please go ahead.
अस्सलाम वालेकुम सर मेरा सवाल से मिलता जुलता जब इस सिस्टर ने पूछा कि आप सजेस्ट करेंगे कि हम जब कुरान जी पढ़ें तो इस तरह पढ़ें जैसे अभी आपने ऑर्डर बताया कि पहले पहले दो चैप्टर पढ़ने के बाद फिर हम पीछे से शुरू करें और सूरह तौबा की तरफ आए, जैसे क्योंकि वो बिगिन कर है, या ये वो चैप्टर वाइज पढ़ेंगे, अनजार फिर नज़ारे आम फिर
As I said, for your own personal study, you can, do anything, any academic study, you can group the phases and you can read the phase, you can read the Quran phase-wise. But as far as I am concerned, when I am going to, conduct this course, I'll be doing it in the sequence that the Quran we have today, in that sequence. So we'll study the first chapter and the next and the next. It's like the 7 chapters in order. That's what I'm going to do. But I think for your own better understanding, it would be that you first complete this reading of 7 chapters of the way the Quran we have, and the next step is to go into detail by grouping all those surahs. Because as yet we have yet to plunge ourselves in the Quran. So I think it would be better that you have a fair idea of how the whole Quran progresses. Once that is in your mind, then it would be much better that you go, in a phase-wise reading of the Quran.
Thank you very much, everyone. We have one more question. Fabia, please go ahead.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullah. Professor, you talked about Quran does refer ayahs of Torah, whereas scholars mostly prohibit to go towards earlier books. And they present an argument or istidlal by reminding us a riwayah where we see Prophet didn't like Hazrat Umar Razirana's reading Torah in front of him. So what was the hikmah behind Prophet's disliking it or prohibiting Hazrat Umar Razirana?
So I think I've discussed this riwayat elsewhere, and it is not. It's not a very sound narrative. If you go, I think in one of my, I'm not sure where I did it, but as far as the authenticity of this narrative is concerned, that the Prophet disliked Umar reading the Torah, it's not authentically ascribed to the Prophet.
Assalamu alaikum, sir. I'm not sure whether my connection is correct or not, but I think there is a confusion in my mind that I understood that from phase 1 to phase 7, at least in the Meccan period, it is chronological, all the surahs. But from what you, or at least what I've understood now, that it is in each phase, in each chapter, it is chronological, but not from 1 to 7. Is that so?
No, both of these things are correct in their own fashion. The phases are also linear, but not every chapter has all the phases. And within a chapter, all the surahs occur in a sequence, which is a chronological sequence. So the Inzar-e-Am phase will always come after the Inzar phase. The Itmam al-Hujjah phase will always come after the Inzar-e-Am phase. So that is why you can see that chronological sequence within a chapter. That's precisely the reason that within the chapter you'll find that whichever 2 or 3 phases are juxtaposed, they are exactly in the historical sequence. I mean, you'll never find the Itmam al-Hujjah phase first and then you'll get it followed by, for example, the Insar phase. The Insar phase will always come first because historically it was always first. So both these are correct.
But then it means that what I had originally thought, that it is Inzar-e-Am, then Inzar-e-Am, and Itmam-e-Hujjah, and like that. So it's from what you are saying, it seems it is this, but it is repeated over say 13 or 15 years, that the phases are repeated. If it's
No, what I'm saying is that when you see at times 2 or 3 surahs are revealed in the same phase and they are placed in different chapters. So, for example, in the Inzar-e-Am phase, couple of surahs would be revealed and some of them would be placed in one chapter, another in another chapter, and still another in other chapters. So, it's not that all the Inzar surahs were placed always in the same sequence at the same time. Imagine that you're standing in the Insar period. The Quran is being revealed. So, in the Insar period, we know that 6 surahs were revealed. So, 6 of them were revealed one after the other. And if you go on to the Inzar-e-Am phase, you'll find that the Inzar-e-Am phase is distributed in 3 or 4 or 5 chapters. So, those surahs, as they were being revealed, some of them were placed in one chapter, some of them in other chapter, and so on and so forth. So, whenever they were placed and whatever shape that they took, what I'm saying is that, you have to listen to this carefully, that within the chapter, always there is a historical sequence. And not only that, the sequence also follows the phases that you have just referred to, because phase 2 and phase 3 and phase 4, wherever they occur, 2 will always come before 3 and 3 will always come before 4. You will never find phase 3 mentioned first in a chapter and then phase 2. 2 will always precede 3 and 3 will always precede 4. But it's not always that all the chapters are mentioned all the surahs are mentioned in the chapter, or all the phases are mentioned in the chapter. So the phases are not always all of them mentioned. I just remarked that in chapter number 7, which is the richest, Meccan chapter, you have 5 phases distributed there. And this is the maximum that you have. Or 5 or 4.
I think I understand, but sorry to repeat myself. So what I understood earlier is not correct, that from phase 1 of chapter 1 to chapter 7, it's all chronological. It's
No,
not like
that's
that.
not correct. Yeah, it's
okay,
not like
so
that.
I misunderstood. Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Thank you for the clarification. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you very much, my dear teacher, for a beautiful session. It seems that everything is organized, and it is organized in a descending sequence. Things coming first are followed by things coming after, but then they're further divided into periods, and they're further divided into eras. So everything is one after the other, depending on each period and an era. Meccan followed by Medinan, and Zare-As, if we can call that, followed by Inzar-e-Am. Chapters 1 and then the other sequence from the last chapter going up to the chapter 2. So there are many could we say, layers of the compilation of the Quran. Would that be a correct estimate?
Yes, as I said, this is a very advanced understanding of the Quran, and I mean, for a common reader, I mean, it could be boring because not everyone would like to go so deep. So only students who are interested in going very deep into the Quran and would like to understand the wisdom of that depth. This course is primarily meant for them. Otherwise, as I said earlier on, that for a simple reading of the Quran, which is meant to obtain guidance, you don't need to have this elaborate discussion or go through that. A simple translation of the Quran, pick up any translation, and the guidance that you will get from any translation would be enough for your own salvation. So this is basically not a course for a commoner or a beginner. It's like a course for advanced students who would like to see how the Quran is arranged, how things have been placed, and how we can deduce directives from the Quran. So it's an advanced course, and people who would be interested in finding out these details should be the ones who should attend, I would say. Otherwise, I think I would always refer them to other courses which might be more useful for them.
Thank you so much, sir. Somebody said this could never be boring, and lightning is more appropriate. So that's a very good statement. Thank you so much, everybody. And thank you, Dr. Shehzad Saleem. We'll see you next time, inshallah.